Oftentimes, when an open world game taking place in an urban environment is released, the obvious comparison is to Grand Theft Auto. Unfortunately, many games tend to fail when being directly compared to a behemoth like that, especially for an original IP. Enter Sleeping Dogs, which was released in 2012 and then given a definitive edition facelift in 2014. Instead of it taking place in some fictional American city, the whole game is based around Hong Kong. It's a unique setting that is often unexplored, especially for Canadian developer United Front Games. While it did ultimately fall short of sales expectations according to Square Enix, and the developer is no longer with us, is this open world title still worth playing? When you start the game, you're part of a drug bust that is about to go down. You play as Wei Shen, who is an undercover cop that is sent to Hong Kong to infiltrate a triad organization named Sun On Yi. To begin with, he reconvenes with his old friend from the past in Jackie Ma, who introduces him to a red pole named Winston, who takes him in as a low-level triad member. I won't give too much else in terms of story for spoiler reasons, but just know that this is a surprisingly good one. Open world games are usually pretty weak in terms of the narrative, but Sleeping Dogs is an actually very solid one. Early on, you'll be able to tell the story ultimately serves as an homage to many classic Chinese kung fu movies. If you watched any 90s to 2000s Hong Kong police gangster movie, you'll feel right at home here. Despite how predictable the plot is at certain points, it is still highly effective with memorable characters throughout. Sometimes a simple but effective story is all you really need to keep players engaged to the end. What really elevates this game for me from a storytelling perspective is just how great of a cast this is. This features a ton of well-known and talented Asian actors and actresses, including Will Young Lee, the late Elizabeth Sung, Kelly Hu, and even the legendary venerable James Hong. You know you got a good thing going if James Hong is on board. Having a cast of this caliber really helps with the authenticity of the overall presentation. As with any urban open world game, there will be a crap ton of driving involved. Thankfully, the world itself is quite small, so you can reach from one end of the city to the other in relative ease. Despite the relatively lower scale compared to other open world games of the time, the density far makes up for it with various activities to complete along the way. More on what you can do later. For driving, there are a nice variety of vehicles to drive, from various cop cars to the late game supercars that are a ton of fun to drive. I personally stuck with the motorcycles for how they handled. Along with the variety of vehicles comes with a variety of music stations to listen to. In regards to every open world game I've played, this has to be one of the best radio stations playlists of all time. Most games usually only have like one or two good genres, with many other stations being left behind, while Sleeping Dogs bucks the trend with having great songs from all genres. I'm often switching between them for how great all the licensed tracks are. Whether you're into rock, metal, electronica, classical, and even some rap, you'll easily find a station that you'll vibe to. There are even some modern Chinese hits to find to further add to the game's authenticity. While the driving itself is good for the most part, I'm not a fan of the ramming mechanic. Instead of running into another vehicle to try to wreck their car, you have to press a button in order to ram your car into them. It looks bad and feels like an added mechanic for the sake of having one. I would rather have seen a more natural system where you can make them spin out with a side swipe, or force a psychological error where they have a head-on collision with a traffic car. Eventually, you'll run into your first combat encounter, and this is one of the main selling points of the game. Since you're in Hong Kong and the game is highly influenced by old school kung fu movies, you'll be using your fists of fury to defeat your enemies. Sleeping Dogs came out at a time where Arkham combat was all the rage, so if you're familiar with that, you'll feel right at home here. You'll have your light attacks that can be chained up into various heavy attacks. You also have a counter button to use when an enemy flashes red. For some reason, the counter has always felt a bit sluggish in this game, as I always had to press it much earlier than anticipated. It could just be me and my setup, but the counter system never felt as refined as the Arkham games. What really makes the hand-to-hand fighting enjoyable are the environmental interactions. If you grab a character and bring them to a specific object in the area, Wei Shen will perform an environmental grapple that will knock out the enemy instantly. Some of these can be pretty brutal, like shoving someone's face into a fan or throwing someone in a furnace. It's funny to me how you're trying not to kill people early on, but eventually will have dozens of bodies under your name. The combat is not all Fist of Fury though, as guns are are eventually involved and get introduced. There are only a handful of guns that you can find, and most of the time you won't be able to keep them in your inventory. You can only hold one gun at a time with a very limited amount of ammo. Even though the hand-to-hand combat is more of the highlight and is more prominently featured, the gunplay is still a lot of fun. It is a third-person cover system similar to many games at the time like Gears of War and Mass Effect. There's also some bullet time thrown in to really satisfy that John Woo craving. Gunplay also extends to driving, which is really where the gameplay shines. Instead of just shooting the people in the car or to the vehicle itself, taking out wheels is a legit strategy. If you want to conserve ammo, it's better to just shoot the tires of the truck rather than trying to whittle down the vehicle's health. For how fun this is, there aren't enough video games that take advantage of this mechanic. As mentioned prior, the Hong Kong movie aesthetic is found all over this game, and even so when on foot. At times you'll be involved in chase sequences where you have to press a button to time your parkour maneuvers. Not pressing the button will result in Wei Shen being clumsy and falling behind who he's chasing. Personally, I can take it or leave it, but I do like how chase sequences involve a bit more than just running forward. When you complete main missions, you're given a ranking for both your cop duties and triad activity. Cop rank involves playing it safe by not hurting innocents or destroying property, while the triad rank involves how much damage you do to your opponents. Stuff like heavy attacks, weapon attacks, and environmental attacks heavily increase your triad rank. Leveling up in both gains a point that can be used to unlock an upgrade. There's quite a few upgrades to get, so definitely look to perform to the best of your abilities. To me, a true urban open world sandbox really thrives with its side activities, and Sleeping Dogs provides a decent amount. You can buy clothes, go racing, participate in brawls, search for collectibles, and even participate in the various side quests. This all sounds great until you realize how little of everything there actually is. The racing is pretty unsatisfying with rubber band AI, along with collectibles being nothing more than busy work. Outside of the legendary outfits, most of the clothing tends to repeat, and there aren't a ton of side quests to complete. I also wasn't trying to spit a bar or rhyme, but that's how it came out this time. According to howlongtobeat.com, the game could take about 14.5 hours if you just focus on the main story, and 23.5 hours if you pursue the side quests. To me, this is generous as I completed both the main story and the side quests within 19.5 hours. Some people may see this as too short of a game, but I honestly prefer this as it doesn't drag out the story like a lot of open world games tend to do. And outside of the main story, there are two separate DLCs that can be accessed within the main menu. Just to clarify, all DLC is included in the definitive edition, so no need to worry there. The first one we will go over is called Nightmare in North Point. This is a non-canon spin-off of the main game where it takes a more horror vibe. This pack reminds me a lot of the Undead Nightmare expansion from the original Red Dead Redemption. I'm guessing the 2010s was all about having a horror-based DLC for some reason. Alright, so the goal of the DLC is this. Basically, you're on a date with one of the characters from the main story. On that date, a former Dead Triad member named Big Scar Wu returns and looks to seek revenge on the Sun On Yi. He takes your date and now it's time to get her back. Honestly, I'm pretty mixed on the DLC. For one, I appreciate the game's commitment to the new horror aesthetic. Similar to the main game, there are a lot of callbacks to prior horror movies. On the other hand, it's all just window dressing as fighting the zombies gets very samey very quickly. There's also a lack of environmental interactions compared to the main game, making the combat feel more repetitive than before. Since this whole campaign is non-canon anyways, you can skip out on it without missing much in terms of story. The second one is called Year of the Snake, which is what I was looking forward to more between the two. Unlike Nightmare in North Point, Year of the Snake is completely canonic and is the closest we will get to knowing Wei after the events of the main story. Due to all the violence and chaos, Wei Shen is demoted to being an ordinary cop in the streets and must rise through the ranks from the beginning. In the meantime, a terrorist organization is looking to ruin Chinese New Year, hence the name of the DLC. Once again, it is up to Wei Shen to stop the cult and save the day. Despite my initial optimism for this DLC, I found it to be lacking in a very similar way. Just like with Nightmare at North Point, it's a bunch of combat with not much else in between. It really goes to show you just how much variety was in the main game that it is a bit of a shame that it couldn't be replicated here. Despite this, I found it to be the superior one between the two DLCs due to some new combat maneuvers to try out. It's also the longer of the two, giving you much more playtime if you're looking for that. Overall, I can definitely recommend this game as a very enjoyable open world title. The story is great, the music is fantastic, and the unique setting of Hong Kong gives this game its own unique vibe. Most of my issues stem from minor gripes like not having more side activities, but nothing that detracts from the overall quality. It's a shame that a sequel was not released, although I do feel that the game was pretty conclusive by the end. We definitely need more games set in other parts of the world to help with variety. I would be down with a Mafia-based title in Italy. Let me hijack a damn gondola for goodness sakes. That's what Mafia 4 should be. All jokes aside, give Sleeping Dogs Definitive Edition a try, and you won't regret it, especially for how cheap it sells nowadays. It sells for $20 currently, which is already a great value, but also drops down to $2 during big sales. It's an absolute steal at that price and nearly impossible to pass up. Thank you all for watching as always, and this is Powerhouse, signing off.